interesting if we did a COVID edition. Because while we were filming at the beginning of the pandemic, there has also been a lot of, since we were filming last, it's been like a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And there has been a lot that has happened for everyone now that kind of COVID is our new normal. And so we thought that we would share what COVID looked like for the Winder family. So COVID started, I was 7 months pregnant with Ephraim, or maybe just a little bit less than that, like 6.5 months pregnant with Ephraim, because it started in like February, March. So I was like 6.5 months pregnant with Ephraim, and we started hearing this, this thing called COVID, and I know Tami and Colton probably both knew exactly what that meant at the time, because they're in the healthcare industry. But behind the scenes, we actually were talking to Kimberly at the time, and she was going to come visit us. And I remember this conversation that I had with her, and she was letting us know, like, hey, well, have you heard the stuff about COVID? And I will be honest, at the time, there was so much politics surrounding like the whole Trump stuff that I was not following all of that. And so when she was asking me about it, I had to like go and like figure out what she was talking about. And then we kind of talked with her what that looked like, how she felt about it, how we felt about it. And there were very strong political views on both sides of it. And I don't know if we've ever taken this like seriously strong stance other than, hey, we don't know what this looks like. Let's just be careful. And especially being pregnant, there was not a lot of information out there whether it would affect pregnant women and their child, and so it was really fearful for a minute there. So we had talked with Kimberly about coming out. It was before all of those cases had started popping up. The only cases were in like Florida and California. And we had a flight booked for her, and we got cleared down to the wire. And I think that she got nervous. We got a little bit nervous. Then I think there was a case that popped up in her home state that I remember, and one in our state too. It was about 3.5 hours from where we live, but it was still within our state. And so Kimberly had planned to come out before we had the baby. Everything was scheduled, everything was ready to go, and then those cases popped up, and we kind of decided that maybe it would be better to wait until we could mitigate the risk, because we didn't know what that looked like with me being pregnant with Ephraim, and making sure, you've gone 9 months after years of infertility, and you want to keep that baby safe to get them here while you're navigating what this new world looks like with COVID. So we ended up postponing the trip with Kimberly, and it was I think Ephraim was about 3 months old by the time things started
opening back up.
The film crew was able to come back out and start filming with us. At that point, I think that everyone had been able to figure out what the little bit of a new norm was. Testing was more readily available, and so there was just protocols for filming. Everybody got tested before they came to our home, and what else? So we decided that at that point we felt like Ephraim was a little bit bigger, that hopefully if something had happened, like with any sort of respiratory stuff, that he would be okay, because he was bigger at that point, that we would be able to handle that situation a little bit better. But we had discussed all of these protocols to put in place, where everybody would get tested before we came into contact, and then we we didn't eat out. We got takeout and brought it into our home, and so we were able to visit with Kimberly here at our home after everyone had been tested, and we felt like everything was safe, and we didn't end up having any problems. We had a good visit with her, and yeah, so you guys got to see the rest of that filming. But COVID in our family, Tami and I, we've looked back on kind of this, and now with what it is now, it's kind of like COVID is our new norm, and I don't know how many strains have come through and things like that. But looking back on, Sadie at this point too, and she's 7, and at the time I think she was 4.
Almost 5.
Yeah, almost 5, and realizing that even we kind of joke sometimes that like Isabella and Ephraim are our COVID babies, but really Sadie is a COVID baby as much as them, because she didn't have social exposure a whole lot. We did some things getting her out of the house, but
well, she did preschool for a little bit, and then everything just stopped because everything shut down and things were different after that. And then we had decided going into kindergarten the next year, everyone was having to wear masks and all of those things, and we did have Sophie was pregnant again, and so we just decided we were just homeschool and not worry about just minimizing exposure to things, because we didn't know what things looked like still, how I think we hadn't gotten sick yet.
We hadn't gotten sick, but a close family member in Colton's family was pregnant, and she ended up miscarrying. She was like 24 weeks. She was pretty far along, and she ended up getting COVID and miscarrying. And so I feel like that kind of, we had started lightening up a little bit, because we were like, okay, things are more normal now. It's not as crazy as we thought it was. And then she ended up miscarrying, and that was a big shock and a big fear at the time. And I was pregnant with Isabella, and so we kind of tightened things back down.
Yeah.
And so that's the hard part with COVID, is there's so much unknown. It's like we're the lab rats at this point, like figuring out what happens when you do this, and there's not very many studies going on, and
well, the information changes, it'd be like, well, this is what we know, and then 4 weeks later it's like, actually now we know all of these things, and that wasn't quite right, and it's actually more like this, and it just feels like it's constantly changing, which it is. And so it makes it hard to just dial in and know, like, this is the new norm, because the new norm is constantly changing.
Yeah. And so because of that, there was a lot of fear going on, and we handled things, I feel like it was really, really hard for us, but we handled things the best way that we knew how to at the time. There was, you guys, did you get tested, and was it positive? Like when we were oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, so
was I pregnant with Ephraim or Isabella?
You were pregnant with Isabella.
Isabella.
So it was actually, you might not have been pregnant yet.
But Ephraim
was it was in February. So it was like Ephraim was almost a year.
Okay.
Yeah, Ephraim was almost a year old, and like you weren't pregnant with Isabella yet.
Oh, I might have been.
No, it was February. You got pregnant in March.
Oh. Okay.
I remember these things. There was a lot going on at that time.
Yes, there was. So have you had it twice or once?
I've had it twice.
Okay, so was the first time in February?
The first time was in February.
Okay.
That I got sick and Colton got sick, and we quarantined because we wanted to make sure that if it was possible, not everyone gets sick, we would do that. So Sophie stayed upstairs, and I stayed downstairs with Sadie, and I don't remember what Colton did.
Colton stayed in one of our guest bedrooms. He was like this third party away from. So Tami had Sadie, I had Ephraim, and Colton was like this third party away from both of us. Because let's see, so she tested positive, and I tested right away to make sure that I didn't have it because I was pregnant with Isabella and I was kind of
You
worried.
weren't pregnant yet?
I keep thinking I was.
Nope.
That was the second time around, right?
The second time.
We've been tested so many times, you guys.
It's true. So true.
Anyways, so because I was so worried, just because Ephraim actually did have some breathing problems that we were worried about, and so I think I just had a lot of fear still built up from all of that, and really fear about COVID in general. Like, even without children being involved, there was just a lot of fear surrounding it. So when Tami tested positive, I went and I tested and I was negative, and Colton went and tested too, but his was like this ghost line.
Yeah.
So we didn't actually know whether he had it or whether he didn't, and so if he had it, then he could have just like gone and stayed with Tami during the time, but then we weren't actually sure if he had it for sure. And so that was so difficult to navigate, especially because like we were all in the same home and Ephraim and Sadie wanted to play together. That was the hardest
that was
part.
the hardest. It was so
Keeping
sad.
our children away from each other was the hardest part.
Yeah.
Because then it's like we try so hard to have a cohesive one family unit, and then we're like, hey, you can't play with your siblings, sorry.
Even though we're in the same house, you can't go by them.
It was so hard, and then even after that, like after our quarantine was up, so we followed the CDC guidelines. When were the symptoms? When did the symptoms start? How many days? And the sad part about that was because Colton didn't test right away either. Like, he tested a couple of days later after Tami had tested and I had tested. And we finally decided that he should test. And so like the time periods got pushed out. So it was like Tami tested positive. These were when her symptoms were. And then Colton tested, but it was this ghost line, so we had to go based off of that date. So it was like pushing it out even more, the how many days we had to like isolate from each other, quarantine from each other. And so that sucked in of itself, because back then it was like 14 days?
14 days.
14 days, guys. 14 days of keeping a 10-month-old away from
5-year-old.
a 5-year-old. And it was rough. And then once our quarantine was over...
Well, it was really weird. It was like we had to kind of relearn to communicate, because
we're like,
even though we weren't trying to...
Keeping a distance from each other.
Yeah, it felt like we'd been giving each other the silent treatment.
Yes.
Even though we weren't trying to.
Worse.
So then when we were like trying to get back together, it was like, I kind of feel mad at you, but I'm not trying to, because I know you weren't giving me the silent treatment on purpose. Like, I understand why we were doing it, but it still feels like you were giving me the silent treatment, and I'm a little salty.
And we had to kind of be salty, but not in the sense of like being salty. Well, I don't know. I felt like we were salty.
It felt like we were for a while. Like, and so it was like having to work through that and be like, forgive each other for nothing, kind of. It was really weird and hard.
I'm sorry we had to quarantine from each other and not see each other and not talk to each other because we had to stay away from each other.
Yeah. Well, and it was interesting how it opened up a new, like, form of communication, maybe. Like, until then, it'd be like, you know, is there an issue we need to talk about? Brush it under the... And then because of this, it was like, it feels weird. It feels like there's something we need to talk about. Is there? No, it's not that. It's just that we haven't talked to each other for 2 weeks. And so, like, I promise everything's fine. So it was just a really different, weird way to have to communicate, like, those feelings. Like, I'm feeling a little salty. Are you feeling that way too? Yeah, I am. Okay, I think it's just from the quarantine. There's not actually anything happening.
The hard part about that is Tami and I can talk about that. And we can logically talk through it and say, oh yeah, it's just because we've been having to do this. And because of that, I've had to like create this barrier between us so that I can just like navigate this by myself, because I'm like over here alone with my child and you're over there alone with yours. But the children don't understand that. And so in a plural family, when you're dealing with this, probably in any family, I would imagine if there's more than one adult, probably a lot of children experience this, especially if I mean, I don't know if there would be a situation where there's different children from different moms in the same house.
Possibly,
Maybe if you're like living with an aunt, like a sister and an aunt or something.
Or if you
like
have
that.
a stepmom.
So probably a lot of people
marriages.
experience this, but Tami and I just talking through it, like, well, we understood what was going on, and we were able to like logically talk through it, and then be like, oh no, I don't have any beef with you. No, it was just this. So now that we've talked about it and we've like identified the issue, I can let my emotions go on that.
Right. Well, it felt really weird to like let those emotions go. It's like I have this like ghost emotion. Like I have this emotion.
It's a hormonal emotion. You don't know where it's coming from.
Except for there were no hormones. It was just like
right.
Like everything is actually fine, but I don't feel fine. It was so weird.
In fact, something to share with like this insight into plural marriage was the feeling was very similar to when we first got married.
Yeah.
When we first got married, we didn't know how to like navigate this, and so we did like a schedule. Our schedule we did was like 3 days with Tami, 2 days with me, 2 days with Tami, because there's 7 days of a week. There's not an even amount of days. And so it was like he would be with Tami for 3 days, and then with me with 2 days, and then Tami with 2 days, and then with me with 3 days. And
it was
so
really weird. I don't even know why we decided that was a good way to do things.
We thought that it would save on gas mileage.
It was not.
But then I was like writing it down on the paper, and I'm like, this doesn't save gas.
This isn't good.
And so, but the problem with that was when I was not seeing him for that chunk of time, and Tami the same, we had to create this boundary, this big barrier between us and Colton, because we were single during those days that he was not there.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to like live two different lives. One where I'm a wife to Colton when he's with me, and then two, like kind of like self-preservation.
Yeah. Well, it was really like 3 too, because then would all come together, and it was like, how do we make it all work together? Kind of like, it almost felt like when you go to a family party with extended family, and it was like, I see you and I know we're related, but we don't really do that much together. Yeah. It was just a really weird time.
Back then, we didn't have our communication established.
Yeah.
Tami and I would go 2 weeks without talking to each other, and then we would like come into talking together, and it was like we had to just try and like go through all of that like that
breaking
surface,
the ice and things,
talking about the weather. What do they call it?
Icebreakers. Yeah, like icebreakers, and just like.
But Colton, sadly, like Tami and I have been able to talk about this since, and we were like, poor Colton. Every time he came to my house after he hadn't been to my house for a while, it took me some time to break down that barrier.
It was like a whole day for me that it was like, okay, I can talk to you normal again.
And so every couple of days, Colton had to go into like this totally cold-shouldered environment where we were just like not talking to him and like easing into having him even in our space.
Yeah, it's so strange thinking about that, and like, because we didn't know what we were doing. We were just trying to figure it out, and for some reason we were like, well, let's try it. It might work really well. And then we eventually got to where we're doing what we are now, which is every other day, which was a lot better even when we went in the separate homes. But now that we're all in the same home together, doing that is so much better. Like, there isn't really any of that anymore. Like, and it is like with the COVID, being able to say like, hey, I'm feeling this emotion. Like, do you feel that way too? Or is it just me? Is it a hormone? Like, whatever. And being able to have that quick conversation instead of dwelling on it for 2 weeks and before going, okay, actually I've got a problem. It's so much better.
Well, yeah, it was really hard because I remember feeling like you were just mad at me. Like, I felt like the reason why we had the COVID restrictions that we did was because I was pregnant, because that's where like all of the fear surrounded was pregnancy and COVID. And so I kind of felt like I was the one to blame because I was pregnant and I was, going through this, and Sadie was 5, and there wasn't a lot of fear out about children, it didn't seem like.
Right, at the time it was children are okay.
But
like,
pregnant women might not be.
There wasn't information. It was like, they might be fine, they might not be. So far it looks like they're all okay.
Right.
Like, it was just really hard. And I felt like it was hard because like I felt like I had really conflicting emotions where it felt like that, like, we're doing this because of you, but also realizing, like, it's not your fault. Like, it's like we're doing it because you're pregnant is why we chose to quarantine and do this. But that doesn't mean it's your fault. Like, it was just, it's so weird. Like,
it was a mental mind game. COVID has been a mental mind game, and I feel like at this point, we've, like, established the tools of dealing with it.
Well, I think that is a big thing. Like, it kind of forced everyone to learn how to communicate differently to handle those things because it was so different than anything any of us have ever experienced yet.
Right.
So being able to, like, just flow with things and figure it out, like working from home and the quarantining and, you know, how to communicate with each other, like, those were things that we didn't really have to figure out because it just wasn't a thing. And then it was a thing, and figuring out what that looks like and how to navigate and how to make it work. It was just all really different and weird.
It is. It's been like, I feel like with plural marriage, we've had to, from the very beginning, back when we were like cold shouldering Colton, we have had to like build up our tools to navigate plural marriage. And then throw COVID into that, we had to build up the tools to navigate that. And like also acknowledgement on both sides. Like for me, when we had to quarantine from Colton and Tami, I had a little one, and then I did end up getting pregnant later. The second time, whatever it was. I can't remember. I think we had, it was that scare. Okay, so they didn't have COVID, but we thought that Sadie did. Did we think that you did too?
Yeah.
So we thought that Tami and Sadie both had COVID, and it was over the weekend and we couldn't get tested for it, or they couldn't get tested for it. And so I was pregnant with Isabella, and Ephraim was little, and I was to the point, I think I was pretty far along.
You were, yeah.
Like I was getting to the point where I couldn't pick up Ephraim very well because he was just heavy and hard to manage being pregnant. And so that was really difficult, being like, okay, now both of my helpers are not able to be around me because we're having to like keep me safe because we still don't know what's going on with COVID. And then on the opposite side of that, how hard it was for Sadie.
Yeah.
Like Tami would just take Sadie and go for drives with just both of them because like
we were just going so stir crazy. She was just like, we can't visit with family, and now I can't even play with my brother, and I can't visit anyone, like any of the other people in the house. She was so stir crazy. So we would just like get in the car and we'd just drive around for a while and look at things, and like we didn't get out, but we drove around and looked, and it at least helped.
Right. And so I think it's just like navigating that together, realizing, I feel like we do that a lot in plural marriage too. It's like sometimes life sucks, and I can see it from your perspective, I can see it from my perspective, and then we both like acknowledge and understand each other, and then we say, Isabella wants to talk. Here's your mic.
She's a talker.
But that's really how we navigate a lot of our problems too, is just by talking and understanding each other and realizing that there are different vantage points. Because if you can understand someone else and validate them with how they're feeling and acknowledging that their perception of something is different than your perception, and it very well can be that both of those perceptions are 100% correct, because I was standing over there and this is what I could see, and you were standing over here and this is what you could see, and this is how it happened for you, and this is how it happened for me.
Well, and there's not always like someone to blame or something to fix. It's just like, you know what, this is the way it is and it sucks. And that's how COVID was. It was like, this is just the way it is, and I know this is why I feel this way, but it still sucks. There's not really anything else we can do about it. It just sucks.
So really like communicating and validating, and then moving forward with how can we do this differently, or kind of like navigating it and understanding it so that you can find like closure to the situation, and then moving forward.
Yeah. I think that acknowledgement of like I know there's nothing we can do about it, but it sucks.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just being able to acknowledge that helps a lot.
Mm-hmm.
When it's like with the quarantining, I was like, you know what, like, I just feel salty because I feel like we've been just giving each other the silent treatment for 2 weeks, and I know that you weren't, and I know that I wasn't, but I still feel that way, and it just sucks.
Right.
And being able to acknowledge that helps let that go and go, I can move on now.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if there's anything else you can think of. It was an interesting time dealing with it, and thankfully we did have a kind of a big enough house that we could quarantine away from each other. But like we would all kind of come to the kitchen at different times and stay across from each other. And
yeah, it was just so weird. I don't know if you guys experienced any of that, like how you handled it, but just the reflection of it, like how weird it was, and that like we still made it work. Like it was weird and hard, but
and it may or may not have driven a wedge between our children.
You know.
I mean, we're still navigating that one. We're like deciphering.
Is it just sibling rivalry or a little more? I'm not sure
just
yet.
Regular sibling rivalry and like, is that just it? Or did they just not understand the situation? Did they not understand COVID and it caused conflict, you know, that they're dealing with?
Right.
I don't know. That's the thing that's really hard with this new COVID world that we're dealing with. That's the other thing. Sadie had a lot of fear when we were like talking to her about what COVID was. Do you remember? Like,
oh yeah,
Colton was like giving her a scientific like understanding of what COVID was.
Yeah.
And then she started freaking out about like washing hands and like bacteria or what else?
Yeah. Oh, just all of it, like getting sick and how does it work, and like really the knowledge is what changes that. Like the fear. Most of the time, I think fear stems from lack of knowledge. Once you learn about that thing, it's not fearful anymore, or it's less fearful.
But children take
and
things
she was
literal.
just like hearing what we were saying and not fully understanding it, and she just was terrified until we were able to explain things in a way that she could understand. And she's still like, I don't know if it's just part of her personality or if it's COVID, that she just has a lot of anxiety about things.
Oh, yeah.
But being able to explain it and put it in her, like she just thinks about things way more than I ever did. Like I didn't know what a germ was till I was like in middle school. You know, like it's just crazy the world that we're in now.
And then you go into like her freaking out about from germs, and I'm like, hey, you guys have the same germs. You guys have the same germs. He doesn't have germs that you don't have, so it's fine. I promise.
Yeah, it's
like making sure we cut all of that like segregation, the starting of segregating.
Right.
Like, nope, hey, you're fine.
It's the same.
It's fine.
It's good. Well, it's true. You know, like you don't. It's so there's so many finesse little details with all of that it's just hard.
It's
to teach it all.
Well, and I feel like we have several layers. Co-parenting is hard. And like we knew that we wanted to make sure from the very beginning that we wanted our kids to respect each of us as a mom.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to get on the same page of like house rules so that we could teach our children and like help them know what the boundaries were and everything very early on. But then it's like, okay, is this normal? Like, do other people's children do this or just ours?
Right?
It's hard. It's like, is this a plural thing? Or is this a sibling thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Can someone let us know? Maybe we'll have little excerpts on our social media. We'll ask you guys, we'll say, hey, this is a situation. Is this normal in your household?
Right. Nope, just us, I guess.
Or is this a COVID thing?
Right. Who knows?
I don't know. It's pretty fun, though.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty fun. Just talking about, and thankfully we can laugh about it at this point.
Right.
Oh my goodness. Silly kids. Anyways, we hope you guys enjoyed our COVID edition. We thought it'd be fun to just kind of share with you guys what that looked like for us.
Yeah.
Because maybe it was different than your guys' experience, or maybe it was exactly the same. I don't know. But you'll have to let us know. Thanks for joining.